The streets of Oakwood were unusually quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that felt heavy, almost foreboding. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple in the sky. In a well-kept suburban neighborhood, a group of children laughed and played in their driveway, their carefree energy lighting up the otherwise serene scene. These were the children of Senator Marcus Reed, a man celebrated for his commitment to justice and equality. To his neighbors, Marcus wasn't just a politician. He was a father, a mentor, and a symbol of hope. But hope has a way of being tested. Just a few blocks away, two police officers sat in their squad car, scanning the quiet streets. Officer Daniels, a rookie with just a year on the force, glanced nervously at his more seasoned partner, Officer Grayson. Grayson, known for his brusque demeanor, leaned back in his seat, sipping coffee as he eyed the glowing screen of their patrol laptop. Suspicious activity reported near Evergreen, Grayson muttered, narrowing his eyes at the screen. Could be anything. A break-in, loitering, maybe kids causing trouble. Daniels nodded, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He wasn't entirely sure how to navigate Grayson's abrasive style, nor was he confident in his ability to handle what the night might bring. The report was vague, but they both knew the unspoken rule: better to act than explain why you didn't. Minutes later, the squad car rolled up to Evergreen Avenue. Grayson scanned the street, his sharp gaze landing on a group of kids playing basketball in a driveway. Daniels noticed them too. The kids, two boys and a girl, all under 15, didn't seem out of place. They were laughing, calling out plays, and arguing over whose turn it was to shoot. That them? Daniels asked hesitantly. Grayson shrugged, his hand already moving toward the door handle. Let's find out. The officers approached the group, their presence immediately casting a shadow over the cheerful scene. The eldest boy, Jamal, noticed them first. He stopped mid-dribble, the basketball bouncing away as he grabbed his younger sister's hand. His face hardened, a mix of confusion and guardedness replacing his carefree smile. "Evening, officers," he said cautiously, his voice steady but tense. Grayson's eyes flicked between the kids, then landed on Jamal. "What are you all doing out here?" Jamal exchanged a quick glance with his siblings. "Playing basketball," he replied simply, gesturing to the ball now rolling into the street. "Got a call about suspicious activity," Grayson said, his tone sharp. "You live around here?" "Yes, sir," Jamal said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "This is our house." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. Something about the scene felt wrong, but he stayed quiet as Grayson pressed on. "Got ID?" Grayson demanded. Jamal blinked, his brows furrowing. "I'm 14, he said. "Why would I have ID?" "Smart mouth, huh?" Grayson stepped closer, his presence looming. "What about your parents? They home?" "Our dad's not here right now," Jamal answered, his voice tightening. Daniel's heart sank. He knew it was coming but felt powerless to stop it. Grayson's hand was already moving toward his belt, where his radio and cuffs sat. "Well, we'll just have to check things out," Grayson said, pulling out a flashlight. "Step aside." Jamal stood his ground, his little sister clutching his arm. "You don't have to go inside," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We're not doing anything wrong." The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of charged silence that precedes a storm. Grayson's jaw tightened as he reached for his radio, muttering something about backup. Daniels could feel his pulse quickening, a mix of anxiety and guilt knotting in his stomach. He wanted to say something, to intervene, but the words stuck in his throat. And then it happened. From down the street, a car pulled into the driveway. Its headlights illuminated the tense scene, revealing a figure that instantly commanded attention. Senator Marcus Reed stepped out, his expression a mix of disbelief and quiet fury. He didn't yell, didn't rush forward. He simply stood there, his presence as commanding as his reputation. Grayson froze, his flashlight beam wavering as he recognized the man before him. Daniel's eyes widened in shock, his mind racing. The children, now visibly shaken, ran to their father, clinging to him as he wrapped his arms protectively around them. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air, each person acutely aware of the implications of what had just transpired. Then Marcus broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "Officers," he said, his eyes locking onto Grayson's, "do you have a warrant to be here?" Grayson stammered, his earlier confidence now replaced with hesitation. No, sir. We were just..." Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "You've done enough." What happened next would shake the entire community and spark a national conversation about accountability, racial profiling, and the power of standing up for what's right. But in that moment, standing under the dim glow of the streetlights, no one could have predicted how quickly things were about to unravel. The quiet tension lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. Senator Marcus Reed stood tall, his composed demeanor unshaken despite the turmoil bubbling under the surface. His children clung to him, their small hands gripping his arms, as though he was their shield against the world. Jamal, the oldest, looked up at his father, his expression conflicted, half relieved, half furious. Grayson adjusted his stance, his eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the kids. The bravado he'd worn moments ago was now slipping, replaced by uncertainty. Daniels, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear. He shifted on his feet, glancing down at the ground as if hoping it might swallow him whole. "Sir, we were responding to a call," Grayson said, his voice lower now but still defensive. "Suspicious activity in the area." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unrelenting. "Suspicious activity," he repeated, each word weighted. "In my driveway, by my children, playing basketball." Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but quickly realized there was no good answer. The silence that followed was damning. The neighbors, drawn by the flashing patrol lights, began to step out onto their porches, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and concern. The soft murmurs of their voices carried through the still evening air. Marcus's youngest daughter, Ava, buried her face in his side, her small frame trembling. Her brother Jamal reached over and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though his own face betrayed the unease he was feeling. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice steady but razor-sharp. "You've already made this a spectacle. You've scared my children. Now, I suggest you step away from my property and explain yourselves to me." Daniels looked over at Grayson, his expression pleading, but Grayson hesitated, still gripping his flashlight tightly. It was as though he couldn't bring himself to admit defeat, not here, not in front of an audience. "So, Grayson started, but Marcus cut him off with a raised hand. "No more excuses," Marcus said firmly. "What you've done here tonight is unacceptable, and you know it, but now you'll have to answer for it." His voice carried just enough authority to draw the attention of the onlookers even more. People were now filming on their phones, capturing every moment. Grayson, visibly flustered, shifted uncomfortably, while Daniels looked like he wanted to intervene, but lacked the courage to do so. And then, in the midst of it all, a new car arrived, a sleek black sedan pulling up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped Gloria Ramirez, Marcus's longtime chief of staff and close family friend. She was still dressed in her office attire, her heels kicking sharply against the pavement as she approached. "Marcus," she called out, her voice steady but laced with concern. "What's going on here?" Marcus turned slightly, giving her a nod of acknowledgement but keeping his attention on the officers. "It seems my children have been deemed suspicious by our local law enforcement," he said, his tone heavy with sarcasm. Gloria's sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the officers, the patrol car, and the growing crowd. Her jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "Officers," she said, stepping forward, "I'd like to know exactly why you're here, and I suggest you choose your words carefully." Grayson took a step back, clearly overwhelmed, but Daniels finally found his voice. "Ma'am, "We were responding to a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood," he said, his tone apologetic. "We didn't realize." "You didn't realize these were children playing outside their own home," Gloria interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse like a blade. "Did you even stop to think before you acted? Did you ask questions, or did you jump to conclusions based on what you saw?" Daniel swallowed hard, his face pale. We were just following protocol," he stammered. "Protocol," Marcus repeated, his voice cold. "Let me tell you what your so-called protocol has done. It's traumatized my children, made them feel unsafe in their own home. Is that what you call protecting and serving?" Grayson finally seemed to realize the weight of the situation. He cleared his throat, his earlier bravado entirely gone. "Senator, we didn't mean any harm," he said weakly. "But harm is exactly what you've caused," Marcus replied, his voice rising slightly for the first time. He gestured to the neighbors filming on their phones. "And everyone here will remember this moment. They'll remember how quickly you jumped to assumptions. They'll remember how this could have ended very differently if I hadn't come outside when I did." The words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on everyone present. Grayson looked like he wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the look in Marcus' eyes stopped him. He muttered something under his breath and finally took a step back. Daniels, looking thoroughly defeated, nodded slightly. We're sorry," he mumbled, though it was clear he knew the words were inadequate. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage," Marcus said, his tone softening just slightly. "But it's a start. Now, I suggest you leave before this becomes an even bigger issue than it already is." The officers exchanged a glance, then slowly made their way back to their patrol car. The tension in the air began to dissipate, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The neighbors continued to watch, their phones still raised, capturing the aftermath. Marcus turned to his children, crouching down to their level. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice full of concern. Jamal nodded slowly, though his expression remained tense. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet. "But Dad, what if you hadn't come out?" The question hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He didn't have an answer, not one that would satisfy his son or ease his fears. Instead, he pulled all three of his children into a tight hug, holding them close as though he could shield them from the world. Gloria placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. "We need to address this," she said quietly. "Not just for your family, but for every family that's ever been in this position." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "This isn't over," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Not by a long shot." As the patrol car pulled away, the crowd began to disperse, but the unease in the air remained. Marcus stood with his children and Gloria, their silhouettes framed against the glow of the streetlights. The night wasn't over, and neither was the fight that had just begun. The following morning, the Reed household was quieter than usual. Jamal sat at the breakfast table, poking at his cereal without much interest, while his younger siblings sat close by, still shaken from the events of the previous night. Marcus had barely slept, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. His children's faces, wide-eyed with fear, haunted him. He couldn't shake the thought of how things might have escalated had he not arrived when he did. Gloria had stayed late into the night, sitting in the family's living room with Marcus as they pieced together their next steps. She knew Marcus well enough to recognize that his calm exterior masked a deep fury, one that would only grow until he acted. They both agreed that the situation couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just about his family, it was about a pattern, a system, a reality that too many people faced. At the table, Ava finally broke the silence, her small voice tentative. "Daddy, are the police going to come back?" Marcus's heart clenched. He put down his coffee cup and knelt beside her, taking her tiny hands in his. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "They won't. You're safe here, I promise." "But they thought we were bad," she whispered, her big eyes filling with tears. "We weren't doing anything wrong." Jamal, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, his voice sharp. They didn't care, Ava. They just saw us and assumed the worst. Jamal, Marcus said softly, his tone a mix of warning and understanding. But Jamal wasn't done. They didn't even ask any questions, he continued, his hands clenched into fists. They just looked at us and thought we didn't belong here. Marcus stood, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. You're right, Jamal, he said, meeting his gaze. What they did was wrong. And that's why we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone. The conversation stayed with Marcus as he drove to his office later that morning. His mind raced with ideas, strategies, and plans. He couldn't let this incident fade into just another story, another fleeting moment of outrage. It had to mean something. It had to lead to change. When he arrived, Gloria was already there, a stack of papers spread across her desk. I started compiling reports of similar incidents, she said without preamble, holding up a file. There's no shortage of examples. Marcus sat down across from her, flipping through the pages. Each story felt like a punch to the gut. Families harassed, children targeted, lives disrupted, all because of snap judgments and unchecked biases. He stopped on one page, reading the account of a young man who had been handcuffed in front of his home after a neighbor called the police, mistaking him for a burglar. It's a pattern, Marcus said, his voice heavy. And it's not new. But this time, it happened to my kids. That makes it personal. Gloria nodded. We need to be strategic about this, she said. We could hold a press conference, release a statement. No, Marcus interrupted, shaking his head. This isn't about just making noise. It's about action. I want accountability. I want systemic change. Gloria leaned back in her chair, her sharp mind already working through the possibilities. Then we need to take it to the community first, she said. Let people tell their stories. Make it impossible to ignore. Marcus nodded slowly. A town hall, he said. We'll invite everyone, residents, law enforcement, local leaders. This can't just be about blame. It has to be about solutions. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daniels sat in the precinct, staring blankly at his desk. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on him. He couldn't shake the image of the kids' frightened faces or the senator's quiet fury. He had joined the force to help people, to make a difference, but last night had made him question everything. Grayson walked past, muttering under his breath. You're awfully quiet today, he said, dropping a file onto his desk. What's the matter? You've never seen a politician get upset before. Daniels didn't respond, his jaw tightening. Grayson shrugged and moved on, but Daniels couldn't let it go. The unease gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing hour. By midday, he made a decision. He grabbed his coat and headed out, ignoring the curious glances from his colleagues. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he had to do something. When he arrived at Marcus' office, he hesitated outside the door, his nerves threatening to overwhelm him. Finally, he knocked, and Gloria opened the door, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw him. Can I help you? She asked, her tone guarded. I need to speak with Senator Reed, Daniels said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. It's about last night. Gloria studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Marcus looked up as Daniels entered, his expression unreadable. Officer Daniels, Marcus said evenly. What brings you here? Daniels took a deep breath, removing his hat and holding it in his hands. Sir, I came to apologize, he said. Not just for what happened, but for my part in it. I should have spoken up. I should have done more to stop it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Why didn't you? Daniels hesitated, searching for the right words. Fear, he admitted finally. Of going against my partner, of making the wrong call, I don't know, but it doesn't excuse what happened. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Acknowledging that is a start, he said. But words aren't enough. If you really want to make a difference, you'll need to back them up with action. Daniels nodded, his expression determined. Tell me what I can do." Marcus exchanged a glance with Gloria, then looked back at Daniels. "For starters," he said, "you can be at the town hall we're organizing. And this time, you'll listen." The community center buzzed with energy that evening. Rows of chairs filled the large room, and a stage with a modest podium sat at the front. Residents from every corner of Oakwood had come, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and hope. Parents with their children, young professionals, retirees, and students, everyone seemed to feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a reckoning. Marcus stood in a small room backstage, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as he glanced at his reflection in the mirror. Gloria was beside him, clipboard in hand, her sharp focus unwavering. "The turnout's bigger than we expected," she said. "That's good, but it means expectations are high. You ready for this?" Marcus nodded, though his expression was taut. "Ready as I'll ever be," he said. "This isn't about me, though. It's about them." Outside, Jamal sat near the back of the room with Ava and their younger brother, Isaiah. He had insisted on coming, despite Marcus's hesitation. "I want to see this," Jamal had said earlier. "I need to see what happens." The murmur of the crowd quieted as Marcus stepped onto the stage, his commanding presence instantly drawing their attention. He scanned the room, taking in the faces of people who had come to listen, to share, and perhaps to confront. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Thank you for being here tonight. This isn't an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one. Last night, my children were wrongly targeted by law enforcement officers outside our home. They were doing nothing more than being kids, playing basketball in their driveway. Yet they were treated as suspects, not as the innocent children they are." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "This isn't just about my family," he said. "This is about every family that has ever felt the sting of suspicion based solely on how they look or where they live. It's about a system that allows these assumptions to persist, unchecked. Tonight, we're here to discuss not just what's wrong, but what we can do to make it right." The crowd erupted into applause, a mix of solidarity and determination. As Marcus stepped back from the podium, Gloria took the microphone, her calm but assertive voice guiding the next phase of the evening. "We'll begin with personal stories," she said. "If you have an experience to share, please line up at the microphone stands on either side of the room." One by one, people came forward. A young man recounted being stopped and frisked on his way home from work, his voice trembling with the memory. A mother spoke of her teenage son being followed by security at a local store, the humiliation etched in her words. An older man shared a story from decades ago, his quiet dignity underscoring the longevity of the problem. Jamal listened intently, his fists clenching as the stories unfolded. He leaned over to Isaiah and whispered, "This is what I was talking about. It's not just us." Isaiah nodded, his expression solemn. Ava, sitting between them, held onto Jamal's arm, her wide eyes fixed on the speakers. When the stories ended, Gloria returned to the stage, her tone shifting to something more pointed. "Thank you to everyone who shared tonight," she said. "Now, we'll hear from the Oakwood Police Department." The room tensed as two officers walked onto the stage. Chief Ramirez, and to everyone's surprise, Officer Daniels. Daniels looked visibly nervous, his eyes scanning the crowd as he adjusted his tie. Chief Ramirez, on the other hand, exuded calm authority as she stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," she began. "First, I want to acknowledge the pain and frustration expressed here tonight. As Chief of Police, it's my responsibility to ensure that every resident of Oakwood feels safe and respected, and clearly we have work to do." Her words were measured, but the crowd remained guarded. They wanted more than acknowledgement, they wanted accountability. "That's why I'm here," she continued, "and it's why Officer Daniels is here as well. He asked to speak tonight, and I believe it's important that he does." Daniels hesitated as he stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the podium. He took a deep breath, his voice shaky as he began. "I know I can't undo what happened last night," he said, "and I can't speak for anyone else on the force, but I can speak for myself. I failed to act when I should have. I stood by when my partner made assumptions and decisions that I knew were wrong, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Daniels looked down for a moment, then back up, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "I joined this department to protect people, to do good," he continued. "But last night, I realized that staying silent isn't protecting anyone. It's enabling the problem. I can't promise to fix everything, but I can promise to do better, to speak up, to hold myself and my colleagues accountable." The silence was broken by a single clap, then another, until the room filled with a tentative but growing applause. Daniels stepped back, his face flushed with emotion, as Chief Ramirez resumed the microphone. "We are committed to change," she said firmly. "Starting with mandatory bias training for all officers, increased community oversight, and clear consequences for misconduct. This isn't just about repairing trust, it's about earning it." The tension in the room began to shift, but it wasn't gone. The crowd was waiting, watching, weighing whether these promises would lead to real change or fade like so many before them. As the meeting continued, Marcus sat in the front row, his mind racing. He knew this was only the beginning, the first step in a much larger fight. But as he glanced back at his children, sitting together with quiet strength, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, sharp and clear. "But what happens when it happens again?" The question sliced through the atmosphere, pulling everyone's attention. Marcus turned toward the source, his jaw tightening. The room braced itself, the tension rebuilding as the question hung in the air. What happens next? The answer would determine everything. The room fell silent as the question echoed, lingering in the air like a challenge no one could ignore. All eyes turned toward the man standing at the back of the room. He was older, with a weathered face that seemed to carry decades of experience and pain. His voice had been steady but tinged with a frustration that resonated deeply. Marcus stood, turning fully to face the man. "That's exactly why we're here tonight," he said firmly. "To make sure it doesn't happen again. But it won't happen through words alone. It'll take action, collective action." The man didn't back down, his gaze locked on Marcus. "And what if the system is too broken to fix?" he countered. "What if all this talk doesn't change a damn thing? People like me have been asking those questions for 50 years. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. The optimism that had started to build wavered, replaced by a creeping doubt. Gloria exchanged a glance with Marcus, her expression urging him to take control of the moment. But before Marcus could respond, another voice interrupted. "That's why we need to demand more than promises." It was a young woman this time, standing near the front. She wore a university sweatshirt and spoke with the fiery conviction of someone who wasn't afraid to shake the room. Accountability isn't just about training or oversight. It's about consequences, real ones. The tension in the room escalated as more voices began chiming in, each one adding to the cacophony of frustration and demands. The dialogue had shifted, no longer contained by the structure Marcus and Gloria had so carefully crafted. It was raw, emotional, and undeniably real. From the stage, Chief Ramirez watched the scene unfold, her composed exterior beginning to crack. Officer Daniels, still standing off to the side, looked like he wanted to disappear. Marcus stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I hear you, and you're right. This isn't just about last night. It's about a system that has failed too many for too long. But we can't let our frustration divide us. If we're going to create change, we have to do it together." The room quieted slightly, though the energy remained electric. The man at the back crossed his arms, clearly unconvinced, while the young woman leaned forward in her seat, waiting to hear more. Marcus took a deep breath, sensing that he was walking a tightrope. What happened to my children shouldn't have happened. And what's worse, it's not an isolated incident. But this fight isn't just about my family or yours, it's about all of us. And it's going to take more than one town hall or one apology to fix it. As Marcus spoke, Gloria's phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing as she read the message. Without a word, she slipped out of the room, her heels clicking against the floor. Marcus noticed but didn't pause, his focus still on the crowd. Moments later, Gloria reappeared, her expression tight and urgent. She leaned in close to Marcus and whispered, "We have a problem." Marcus's stomach tightened. "What is it?" he asked under his breath. Gloria hesitated, her eyes scanning the room before answering. "There's a news crew outside," she said, "and they're not here for a feel-good story. Someone leaked the footage from last night, the bodycam footage." Marcus's mind raced. He had been waiting for the official investigation to release any evidence, but this was unexpected. "What does it show?" he asked, his voice low. Gloria's face hardened. "Everything." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the chest. The footage could either bolster their cause or turn public opinion against them, depending on how it was framed. And if it showed anything compromising, anything that could be twisted or taken out of context, it could undo all the progress they'd made tonight. "We need to get ahead of this," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the anxiety churning inside him. "Where's the crew?" "Out front," Gloria replied. "They're pushing for a statement." Marcus glanced at the crowd, now buzzing with a mix of anticipation and unease. He knew he couldn't leave without addressing them, but ignoring the media would only fuel speculation. The stakes had just been raised, and every move he made from here on out would be scrutinized. "I'll handle it," he said, stepping down from the stage. He turned to the audience, his expression apologetic but resolute. "Excuse me for a moment. I'll be back." As Marcus made his way to the front entrance, Gloria followed close behind, her phone in hand as she fired off messages. When they stepped outside, the bright lights of the news cameras nearly blinded them. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand, her tone sharp and probing. "Senator Reid," she began, "can you comment on the bodycam footage that was leaked earlier today? Critics are already questioning your account of what happened last night." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I haven't seen the footage yet," he said, "but I stand by what I said. My children were wrongly targeted, and this is part of a larger issue that affects families across this community." The reporter didn't miss a beat. "The footage reportedly shows one of the officers claiming that your children matched the description of suspects from an earlier incident. How do you respond to that?" Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he kept it in check. "If that's true," he said, "then it only underscores the problem. My children weren't suspects. They were kids playing in their own driveway. Using vague descriptions as a justification for harassment isn't just flawed, it's dangerous." The crowd that had gathered outside began murmuring, their reactions mixed. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. The reporter pressed on, the questions relentless. "Do you think this situation will impact your political career?" she asked. "And do you believe you've handled it appropriately?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression unflinching. "This isn't about my career," he said. "It's about my family and my community. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one else has to go through what we did." As he spoke, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The leaked footage had introduced a new layer of complexity, and he knew the fight for justice was about to become even more challenging. But as he looked back at the faces of his children watching from the doorway, he felt a renewed determination. No matter what came next, he wouldn't back down. The days following the town hall were a whirlwind of media coverage, community discussions, and private meetings. The leaked bodycam footage had gone viral, igniting debates that extended far beyond Oakwood. On one hand, it revealed the clear missteps of the officers involved, showing how they had relied on vague descriptions and implicit biases to justify their actions. On the other, Critics latched onto every moment that could be spun to cast doubt on Marcus's family or their account of the events. The footage was both a vindication and a weapon, depending on who wielded it. Marcus spent long hours coordinating with Gloria and community leaders, preparing for the formal investigation's findings. Meanwhile, his children found themselves at the center of a media storm they hadn't asked for. Jamal, especially, struggled with the attention. He avoided his friends, stayed off social media, and withdrew into himself. Eva tried to be a source of comfort, but even her usually steady demeanor was starting to fray. Late one evening, as Marcus sat in his study reviewing notes for an upcoming press conference, there was a knock at the door. It was Jamal. He stood there hesitantly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Can we talk?" Jamal asked quietly. Marcus nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Jamal settled into the chair across from him, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've been thinking about everything," Jamal began. "The cops, the footage, all the stuff people are saying about us. And I keep wondering if I made it worse." Marcus frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean, son?" Jamal hesitated, then took a deep breath. "When the cops came that night, I was scared. But I also got mad. I didn't want to back down, you know. I thought if I showed them I wasn't afraid, they'd stop treating us like we didn't belong. But maybe I should have just stayed quiet." Marcus's heart ached as he listened to his son wrestle with the weight of blame that wasn't his to bear. He stood and moved to sit beside Jamal, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said firmly. "You were just being yourself, and that's not something you should ever feel guilty about." Jamal looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if they never see us as anything but threats? What if nothing changes?" Before Marcus could respond, Gloria burst into the room, her phone in hand. "Marcus, you need to see this," she said, her voice urgent. She played a video that had just been uploaded online. It was new footage, security camera footage from a neighbor's property. The angle was distant, but it captured the entire interaction between the officers and Marcus's children. Unlike the bodycam footage, this video had no missing context, no room for misinterpretation. It showed Jamal and his siblings playing basketball, the officers approaching with their hands on their holsters, and the unnecessary escalation that followed. Marcus's chest tightened as he watched. The video wasn't just damning, it was undeniable. And then came the twist. In the final seconds of the footage, another figure appeared on the edge of the frame: Officer Daniels. He wasn't standing by passively, as he had claimed in his apology. Instead, he was gesturing toward the children, nodding as his partner spoke. It was clear he had been an active participant in the decision to confront them. Gloria paused the video, her expression grim. "This changes everything," she said. "Daniels lied." Marcus sat back, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Daniels had positioned himself as a voice of accountability, a sign that the department could change. But the footage revealed a different story, a story of complicity, not courage. It was a betrayal, not just of Marcus's trust, but of the entire community's hope for reform. "What do we do now?" Jamal asked, his voice small. Marcus's resolve hardened. "We show the truth," he said. "All of it." The next day, Marcus called for a press conference. The community center was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Cameras lined the back of the room, and reporters scribbled notes as Marcus took the stage. "I've always believed in transparency and accountability," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And that's why I'm here today, to share the full truth of what happened the night my children were wrongfully confronted by law enforcement." He gestured to a screen behind him, and the newly discovered footage began to play. The room was silent as the events unfolded, the tension palpable. When the clip ended, Marcus turned back to the audience. "This footage speaks for itself," he said. "It shows not just the actions of the officers, but the systemic flaws that allow these actions to occur. And it shows that even those who claim to stand for change can fall short of the truth." As the press conference continued, the focus shifted from individual blame to systemic reform. Marcus called for an independent review of the department, stricter oversight policies, and a community-led initiative to address bias in policing. The final twist came when Chief Ramirez stepped forward, her face set with determination. Effective immediately, she announced, Officer Daniels and his partner have been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and I am committing to working alongside Senator Reid and this community to rebuild trust, not with words, but with actions. The crowd erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs, the weight of the moment sinking in. For Marcus, it wasn't a perfect victory. The scars of that night would remain, and the fight for justice was far from over. But it was a step toward a future where his children, and others like them, could play in their driveways without fear. As the conference ended, Marcus looked over at Jamal, Aval, and Isaiah, standing together in the crowd. They weren't just his children, they were his inspiration, his reason to keep pushing forward. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. In the days following the press conference, the atmosphere in Oakwood began to shift. Conversations that had long been avoided were finally being held out in the open, and for the first time, it felt like the community was moving towards something tangible. The security footage had removed any lingering doubts about what had happened that night, sparking not just outrage, but a collective determination to do better. Marcus spent much of his time meeting with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and advocacy groups to map out a plan for reform. The initial steps were small but meaningful. A civilian oversight board was established, composed of residents from different backgrounds, to review police actions and provide transparency. Training programs were revamped, with an emphasis on de-escalation and implicit bias. These were far from perfect solutions, but they were a start. At home, the Reid family slowly began to heal. Jamal started to open up more, talking about his feelings instead of burying them. He returned to school, where his friends welcomed him back with a sense of normalcy he hadn't realized he missed. Ava threw herself into her art, using her sketches to express the emotions she couldn't always put into words. Isaiah, the youngest, was the first to return to the basketball hoop in their driveway, his laughter slowly filling the air once again. One evening, as the family sat together for dinner, Marcus brought up a question he'd been turning over in his mind. "How do you all feel about everything now?" he asked, looking at each of his children in turn. Jamal was the first to speak. "I still get angry when I think about it," he admitted, "but I'm also proud that we didn't just let it go." Ava nodded. "It feels like we're part of something bigger now. Like what happened to us is helping make things better for other people." Isaiah, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of bread, finally said, "I just hope it means people stop being mean to kids like us." Marcus smiled softly. "I think that's what we're all hoping for." The conversation lingered, touching on the changes happening in Oakwood and the work still left to do. For Marcus, it was a reminder of why he had taken up this fight in the first place, not just for his family, but for every family who had been overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated. A few weeks later, a community event was held in the park downtown. It was a sunny afternoon, and families gathered to celebrate the progress that had been made. There were speeches, music, and tables set up with resources for anyone who wanted to get involved in the ongoing efforts. Marcus stood near the stage, watching as people mingled and shared ideas. Chief Ramirez approached him, her expression warm but serious. "This is a good start," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "But it's just that, a start." Marcus nodded. "I know. The real challenge is keeping the momentum going." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and determination. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't back down. You've made me look at my role differently. And I promise I'll keep pushing from my side." As they shook hands, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't about trusting blindly. It was about holding each other accountable and believing that change, however slow, was possible. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the Reed family walked through the park together. They stopped to watch a group of kids playing basketball on a makeshift court, their laughter ringing out over the hum of the crowd. Jamal smiled, his gaze lingering on the game before turning to his father. "Do you think it'll really get better?" he asked. Marcus put an arm around his son's shoulders. "I do," he said, "because people like you are the future. And as long as you keep speaking up and standing strong, things will keep moving forward." The answer seemed to satisfy Jamal, who nodded before running off to join the game. Ivor and Isaiah followed, their energy infectious as they jumped into the action. Marcus and Gloria stood back, watching their children with a quiet sense of pride and relief. "It's been a long road," Gloria said, slipping her hand into Marcus's. "But I think we're finally heading in the right direction."